Okay, welcome back. Next up, we'll hear from Colin Malloy, who uses ocean data to create songs and raise environmental awareness. Looking forward to learning more, Colin.
Thank you. Hello, I am Colin Malloy, an interdisciplinary PhD student in music and computer science at University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. So in 2022, I was selected to be the artist in residence at Ocean Networks Canada to compose new musical pieces that explore the relationship between our oceans and the oil industry. This residency culminated in a concert presented earlier this year on January 26th at my university. And today I will be presenting on two data sonification methods I employed in composing Oil and Water, a solo electroacoustic work for steel pan and percussion that was the centerpiece of that residency. So data sonification is the practice of transforming data into sound. This is the auditory counterpart to data visualization, which we commonly know in terms of plots and graphs and looking at those kinds of things. In data sonification, various mappings can be used to transform the data to sound. So common methods include mapping data values to the volume of a noise or the frequency of a tone, or using beeps to signal events. An example of that it would be the electrocardiogram, commonly seen in hospitals that signals heartbeat events. So mapping that pulse to the data of frequency of heartbeats. And much like data visualization, data visualization, data sonification can vary from being straightforward and practical to becoming a beautiful work of art in itself. And so it can be very functional, like the AKG, or it can be used in works of music, like what I do. So as a composer and performer, I use data sonification to elicit emotional responses from the audience and enhance the story being portrayed through my music. It's not really for a practical purpose. So the first data sonification method I used in Oil and Water was to use data as a probability curve to trigger disruptive computer audio sounds over my live steel pan playing. I used data from 1901 to 2021, totaling 120 data points. To reflect this, I decided to trigger 120 musical notes over the course of 120 seconds. The sum of all the data points was calculated, and then 120 random numbers between 0 and that sum were generated. For each random number, the timing of its associated sound was determined by the first point on the x-axis, where the sum of the data values to the left are greater than the random number. Since the oil production data values before 1960 are relatively small, you can see that here, right? Quite low, then it gets really big for the world. Since they're relatively small, at the beginning of that, the events are rarely triggered. So using the data as a probability function results in the intrusions gradually growing thicker in density, creating a noisy, viscous layer of sound slowly covering up the steel pan and completely overpowering it by the end. And now I will play a short excerpt from this section of my piece. And so another method that I used in Oil and Water is a process I call data to wave. So in data to wave, I use data sets to define the behavior of an oscillator and a type of synthesizer called a wavetable synthesizer. In wavetable synthesis, the synthesizer uses data from an audio file to define the oscillation methods for these sound source. So it cuts an audio file into extremely short snippets called wavetables and plays them back at very high speeds to create musical notes. For example, to produce the note A440, probably the most famous musical note, the synthesizer cycles through that wave shape, that wavetable, 440 times per second. The shape of the wavetable determines the timbre of the sound being produced. In data to wave, the raw data is resampled and converted to an audio file with the proper formatting to be interpreted by the wavetable synthesizer. In the image shown, you see the synthesizer as I designed it for the bass line in Oil and Water. The collection of squiggly lines on the upper left section over here are the wavetables generated from crude oil price data. Each line is generated from 1 year's worth of data over the course of many years. And then in the upper right section are wavetables generated from per capita oil consumption. In this collection, each line represents the data for a different country. And the two are happening simultaneously to create the new sound. The purpose of having multiple wavetables in each section is to enable the fading between them in order to create a more organic sound. And now I'll play a short excerpt of this sound from the piece Isolated. So this method of sonification creates sound sources that reflect the material that inspires the music. You may not come away understanding the data better, but it deepens the audience's experience of the story behind the music. The data imposes a tonality upon the music that I, as the composer, must work around. This reinforces the connection between the musical sounds and the ideas that inspire them. Unfortunately, due to the limited time available to me, I can't play the entire track for you. If you're interested in hearing it, the QR code on the left leads to the performance video of the piece on YouTube. And in addition to the Oil and Water, I composed and performed several other pieces as part of my residency with Oceanic Canada. The QR code on the right leads to the entire playlist on YouTube. This summer, I plan to record studio versions of all these pieces, and they will hopefully be made available by the end of the year. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and thank you to Ocean Networks Canada for funding this work.
Well, thanks, Colin. I'll start us off with a question. So I'm kind of curious how you got into this line of research mixed with music and into data sonification in general.
Right. So the easiest way is, I have 2 undergraduate degrees, one in math and one in music. And so I've always wanted to combine those together. And then as I grew as a musician, I started working more and more with music technology. And in that, I've always looked for ways to write music that reflects my experience. And so you look for ways to map real-world experiences onto the music to create things that resonate with people, because I work in instrumental music and we don't have the luxury of words to tell our stories. And while a lot of instrumental music is pure and is not attempting to tell any story, I have always liked music that reflects my experience. So I used to write a lot of pieces that emulated what it would be like to be in a music practice room in music school, and then I'd hear everyone else in their own practice rooms in these random snippets. And so as I've grown and done more scientific research, I am interested in incorporating that into my musical practice.
Very cool.
Thank you.
Do you take requests from people who have Ocean Networks Canada data that might like to see it in music?
I definitely could. So I composed 4 pieces. Well, I composed 5 pieces as part of my residency, but I have a list of other ideas that I wanted to do, and you run out of time, right? So there's potentially more pieces in the pipeline once I find the time to do it, but I'm busy finishing my PhD and working, but I'm always excited to do more. So, yeah.
I'll find you after.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
Thanks so much for sharing the QR codes so that we can listen more later.
Oh, yes, please like and subscribe.
We have one question from our virtual attendees. So Maura Shapiro asks, how do you decide what data to include? and how do you implement it in the music?
Right. So that is a huge question for what I do. So usually what I do is I come up with the concept of my piece ahead of time. So Oil and Water is the piece explicitly exploring the oil industry and water. And so I looked for different data sets. And sometimes there was a clear story to be told. For example, the first one, the probabilistic method, there's we use more oil over time. I wanted something to reflect that, but I didn't. The direct mapping of the line to a sound is, I've done it a million times, and it's not as interesting to me anymore. So that's where I came up with the idea of, well, of using it probabilistically, and it just naturally clumps where there's more. We've produced more oil in recent times, so there's going to be more. And then I look for a data, a practical way to employ it. Then I look for, I wanted to reflect what oil is doing, right? So I'm not necessarily trying to condemn the oil industry, but it's taken over our lives, and a lot of its effects intrude on our lives. So I wanted it to intrude on my music. That's what I was playing that was representing the oceans. And then from there, it came together, and then I just designed the sounds using normal sound design techniques. And then other times, like with the data to wave or other methods, I used other methods in other pieces. The main thing I do is I look for a way to semantically reinforce the concepts and make it musically interesting at the same time. And unlike in graphs or even practical sonifications, like, you shouldn't necessarily come away like, oh, I understand this data set really well now, or I found new patterns in it. But hopefully you come away charged up in a different way. And so that it's that more emotional response. Because I also do the practical things, and it's not as fun when you do that in a concert. So.
Speaking of concerts, we have one more question from Catherine Wright at APS, and she's wondering, are any future concerts planned?
So I was just writing an email today, so I'm going to be performing some of these works for part of the Coastal Zone Conference in Victoria. I would love to do more concerts. I don't have much on the books at the moment as I'm navigating ending my PhD, but if anyone wants to hire me, I'm I'm willing to take payment. Or any other opportunities. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, Colin. And we'll be back in 1 minute with our last presenter.